Imagine
What if
holding
I
a
told you
small
the first
magnet in your
people who
hand.
land on
It feels
Mars may
ordinary,
become
almost
the
boring.
most
You've
famous
seen it a
humans
thousand
in
times.
history?
It sticks to metal,
But
it
they
pulls
may
and
never
pushes.
step
Nothing
foot on Earth
surprising. But
again.
what if I told you
This
that
mission
hidden
won't be
inside
a
that
simple
quiet little
space trip.
object is a secret
It
so
could be a
deep,
one-way
so
journey into the
unexpected that it
unknown,
connects
where
directly
a
to the
single
very
mistake
light
means
coming from the
death
stars, to the
and
glow
rescue
on
is
your screen,
almost
to the
impossible.
fundamental rules that hold the
Imagine
universe
leaving your
together.
family,
What if
your
the
planet,
force you casually
and
play with
everything
every
you've
day,
ever known
magnetism,
forever.
isn't
Would
even
you
its
still
own thing?
go?
What if it only
Before we
exists because
begin,
light exists?
comment
Now
below
that sounds
where you're
strange,
watching
almost
from, and
impossible.
if you'd have the
After all,
courage
magnets
to
don't
take
shine, they
humanity's
don't
most
glow,
dangerous
they just
trip.
sit there, silently doing
The
their job.
enormous
And
distance between
light
Earth
seems
and
completely
Mars
different.
is
It
one of the
travels,
biggest
it
reasons
illuminates, it
why the
reveals the
first
world to
humans
us.
on
One
Mars may
feels
never
static, the
return.
other feels alive. So
Unlike
how could
traveling
these
to the
two
moon,
possibly be
which is
connected? But
relatively
here's where
close
things
to
start to
Earth,
get interesting. The
Mars
deeper
sits
you
at a
look,
far
the more
greater
that
distance that
difference begins to
constantly
dissolve.
changes as
The
both
magnet in
planets
your
orbit the
hand and the
Sun.
light in your eyes are
At
not
the
separate
closest point,
actors. They are
Mars
part
can
of the
be
same
around
hidden
54
story. A
million
story where
kilometers
forces
away,
merge, where
but at
motion
other
changes
times it
reality,
can be
where
more
what you
than
see depends on
400
how you
million
look, and where
kilometers
something as simple as
distant.
a universal
This
speed
means any
limit
mission to
quietly shapes
Mars must
everything.
wait for
And
the
once
right
you begin to
launch
follow
window.
this thread, you realize
What if
something
I
even
told you the
more
first people who
unsettling. If
land
you
on
were to
Mars may
remove light,
become
not
the
just the glow
most
you
famous
see, but the
humans
very
in
concept
history?
of it, the entire
But
idea
they
of
may never
magnetism
step
would
foot
collapse,
on Earth
not
again?
weaken, not
This
change,
mission won't
disappear.
be a
So the
simple
question
space
isn't
trip.
just how do
It
magnets
could be a
work? The
one-way
real
journey
question
into the
is what
unknown,
kind of universe
where a
are we
single
living in,
mistake
where a
means
silent
death
piece of
and
metal owes
rescue
its
is almost
existence to something
impossible.
that moves at the fastest
Imagine
speed
leaving your
possible?
family,
Stay
your
with me
planet,
because the answer
and
is not
everything
just
you've ever
surprising.
known
It will
forever.
completely
Would you
change
still
how
go?
you see reality
Before
itself.
we
If you
begin,
take a simple bar
comment
magnet in
below
your hand,
where you're
it
watching
feels like
from,
one of the
and if
most
you'd have the
ordinary objects
courage
in the
to
world.
take
It pulls
humanity's
on
most
bits of
dangerous
iron,
trip.
it snaps onto your
The
refrigerator,
enormous
it
distance
obeys rules
between
you
Earth and
probably
Mars
learned as a
is
child.
one of the
North
biggest
attracts
reasons
south
why
like
the
poles
first
repel.
humans
But
on
the
Mars may
moment you
never
ask a
return.
deeper question, what is
Unlike
this force
traveling to the
really? You
moon,
begin to
which is
uncover
relatively
something far
close
less
to Earth,
ordinary. You discover
Mars
that
sits at a
magnetism is
far
not a
greater
separate
distance
piece of
that
nature,
constantly
not an
changes as both
independent
planets
actor doing
orbit the
its own
Sun.
thing. It is
At the
inseparably tied to
closest point,
electricity
Mars
and
can
even
be
more
around 54
surprisingly, to
million
light
kilometers
itself. What
away,
seems like a
but at
quiet
other
static
times it
force
can be
hiding
more than
inside a chunk of
400
metal is
million
actually a
kilometers
reflection of one of the
distant.
most dynamic
This means
and
any mission
fundamental
to Mars
processes in the
must wait for
universe.
the right
Start with
launch window.
electricity, something slightly more
What if I told
intuitive.
you the first
Electric
people who
charges
land
sit
on
on
Mars may
particles like
become
electrons
the
and
most
protons,
famous
and they
humans in
exert forces
history?
on each other. If two
But they
charges
may
are
never
at rest,
step
they
foot
push
on
or
Earth
pull
again?
along a straight line
This
between
mission
them.
won't be a
That's simple
simple
enough.
space
But
trip.
now, imagine
It
those
could be a
charges begin to
one-way
move.
journey
The
into the
moment
unknown,
motion enters the
where a
picture,
single
something
mistake
new
means
appears,
death
what we call
and rescue is
magnetism. A
almost
moving charge
impossible.
creates a magnetic field, not
Imagine
because
leaving your
nature
family,
decided
your
to invent
planet,
a new force
and
just for
everything you've
motion,
ever
but
known
because the rules
forever.
of space
Would
and
you
time
still
demand
go?
it. The distinction between
Before we begin,
electricity and magnetism
comment
begins to
below
blur.
where
What
you're
you thought
watching
were two
from,
different
and if you'd
forces
have the
are really two
courage to
aspects
take
of the same
humanity's most
underlying
dangerous trip.
interaction. Now bring light into the
The
story.
enormous
Light is not
distance
just
between
brightness or
Earth and
color.
Mars
It is a wave
is one
made
of
of
the biggest
oscillating
reasons
electric and
why the
magnetic
first
fields.
humans
These
on
fields are
Mars
not
may never
static. They
return.
continuously create each
Unlike
other as
traveling
they
to the moon,
propagate through
which
space.
is
A
relatively
changing
close
electric
to
field
Earth,
generates a magnetic
Mars
field,
sits
and
at
a
a
changing
far
magnetic
greater
field
distance that
generates an
constantly
electric field.
changes as
And this
both planets
self-sustaining
orbit the
cycle
Sun.
moves forward at a constant
At the
speed.
closest
That
point,
speed is what we
Mars
call
can be
the speed
around
of light.
54
So
million
light is not
kilometers
separate
away,
from
but at
electromagnetism.
other
It is
times it can be more
electromagnetism
than
in motion. It
400
is what
million
happens when
kilometers
electric and magnetic
distant.
fields detach
This
from their
means any
sources
mission
and
to
travel
Mars
freely
must
across
wait for the
space. This
right launch
immediately
window.
reveals something profound. If
What if I told you
magnetism
the
is
first
part of
people who land on
electromagnetism
Mars may
and light
become
is a
the
manifestation
most
of
famous humans in
electromagnetism, then
history?
magnetism and light are
But they
deeply
may never
connected at the
step
most
foot on
fundamental
Earth
level.
again?
They are not just
This
related
mission won't
concepts,
be a
they are
simple
different
space trip.
expressions of the same
It could
underlying
be a one-way
reality. The
journey into
magnetic
the
field
unknown,
around your bar
where a
magnet
single
and the light
mistake
coming
means
from the
death
sun are built
and
from the
rescue
same
is almost
ingredients, governed by
impossible.
the same equations,
Imagine
constrained
leaving
by the
your
same
family, your
universal
planet,
rules. But the
and
story becomes
everything you've
even more
ever known
interesting when you
forever.
consider
Would you
motion
still
and how
go?
different observers see
Before
the
we
same
begin,
situation. Imagine a wire carrying an electric current. Inside that wire, electrons are moving. Around the wire, a magnetic field forms. That's standard textbook physics. But now imagine you are moving alongside the electrons at the same speed. From your perspective, the electrons are no longer moving. They appear almost stationary. Suddenly, the explanation for the magnetic field has to change because magnetism depends on motion. What you find is that what looked like a magnetic force in one frame of reference can be explained as a purely electric force in another. The difference arises because space and time themselves adjust depending on motion. Lengths contract, time dilates, and charge distributions appear different. This is where the speed of light enters as something more than just a property of light. It becomes a fundamental limit that shapes how space and time behave. The fact that light travels at the same speed for all observers forces the universe to obey the rules of relativity. And relativity in turn reshapes electric forces into magnetic ones when viewed from different frames. Magnetism is not an independent force layered on top of electricity. It is what electricity looks like when you take relativity seriously. If there were no universal speed limit, if the speed of light did not exist as a constant, then the transformations that give rise to magnetic effects would not occur. Magnetism as we know it would simply not emerge. Now go deeper, beyond classical physics, into the quantum world. Here, forces are not continuous fields in the classical sense. They are mediated by particles. The electromagnetic force is carried by photons, the very same particles that make up light. When two electrons repel each other, they are not reaching out across space with invisible strings. They are exchanging photons. These photons are not always the kind you can see. They are often virtual, existing only fleetingly within the rules allowed by quantum mechanics. But they are still the carriers of the interaction. This means that every electric and magnetic effect you observe, from the attraction of a magnet to the repulsion of charges, is ultimately the result of photons being exchanged between particles. Remove photons from the picture and the electromagnetic force disappears. Without that force, electrons would not bind to nuclei, atoms would not form, chemistry would vanish, and without atoms, there would be no materials capable of exhibiting magnetism. The existence of magnets depends on the same fundamental process that produces light. They are both consequences of the quantum behavior of the electromagnetic field. Now consider what a magnet is made of. Inside a piece of magnetic material, such as iron, electrons possess a property called spin, which gives them a tiny magnetic moment. You can think of each electron as a tiny magnet. In most materials, these tiny magnets are oriented randomly, cancelling each other out. But in a ferromagnetic material, interactions between electrons cause many of these spins to align in the same direction. When enough of them align, their combined effect produces a macroscopic magnetic field, the one you observe when you hold a magnet. But why do these spins align? The answer again lies in electromagnetic interactions. The alignment is governed by quantum mechanical rules that depend on how electrons interact through the electromagnetic force. The stability of these aligned states, the energy differences that favor one configuration over another, all come from the exchange of photons between charged particles. The very mechanism that allows a magnet to exist is rooted in light-based interactions at the quantum level. If you imagine removing light from the universe, not just visible light, but the entire electromagnetic interaction, you are left with a radically different reality. There would be no electromagnetic force to hold atoms together. Even if you somehow tried to keep atoms intact, there would be no mechanism for electrons to interact in the way required to produce magnetic alignment. The concept of a magnetic field would have no meaning. There would be no photons to carry the interaction, no relativistic framework to transform electric effects into magnetic ones, no oscillating fields to propagate as waves. The idea that magnetism depends on light is not a poetic metaphor. It is a precise statement about how the universe is constructed. The equations that describe electromagnetism show that electric and magnetic fields are intertwined, and that disturbances in these fields travel as light. The principles of relativity show that magnetism arises naturally from electric forces when you consider the finite speed at which information travels. Quantum theory shows that both electric and magnetic interactions are mediated by photons, the particles of light. So when you hold a magnet, you are not just holding a piece of metal with a mysterious force. You are holding a manifestation of the same fundamental interaction that allows light to exist. The invisible field around the magnet is part of a larger structure that includes every electromagnetic phenomenon in the universe. It is connected to the light from distant stars, to the radio waves carrying signals across the planet, to the forces that bind atoms and shape matter itself. And what makes this truly remarkable is how seamlessly these ideas fit together. What begins as a simple observation, magnets attract iron, leads you through layers of understanding that connect everyday experience to the deepest principles of physics. You move from static forces to moving charges, from fields to waves, from classical ideas to relativistic transformations, from continuous interactions to quantum exchanges. At every step, the same theme emerges. Magnetism cannot stand alone. It is part of a unified framework in which light plays a central role. The next time you see a beam of light or feel the pull of a magnet, you are witnessing different faces of the same phenomenon. One is dynamic, racing through space at an enormous speed, carrying energy across vast distances. The other is seemingly static, anchored in a solid object, exerting forces quietly and persistently. But beneath these differences, they share a common origin. They are both expressions of the electromagnetic field, governed by the same laws, shaped by the same constants, and ultimately dependent on the existence of photons. This realization does something subtle but powerful. It changes the way you think about what is fundamental. Instead of seeing the world as a collection of separate forces and objects, you begin to see patterns, connections, and unifications. Magnetism is no longer an isolated curiosity. It is a window into the structure of reality. Light is no longer just illumination. It is a key to understanding how forces operate at the deepest level. And once you see that connection, it becomes difficult to look at anything in the same way again. So in the end, what began as a simple question about magnets quietly unfolds into something far greater. The force that feels so familiar, so predictable, turns out to be inseparable from one of the most fundamental ingredients of reality itself. Magnetism is not standing on its own. It is woven into the same fabric that produces light, guided by the same rules, carried by the same invisible messengers, and shaped by the same limits that define space and time. And once you truly see that connection, the world stops looking ordinary. The magnet in your hand is no longer just a tool or a toy. It becomes evidence of a deeper unity in nature. A unity where forces are not isolated, where everything is connected beneath the surface, where even the simplest phenomena are whispers of something vast and elegant. That is the real beauty of physics, not just in giving answers, but in revealing how the answers are all tied together in ways we never expected. It shows you that reality is not a collection of separate pieces, it's a single interconnected story. So as you walk away from this, don't just remember that magnets and light are related. Remember that curiosity is what uncovers these hidden links. Keep asking questions that feel too simple, because sometimes those are the ones that lead to the deepest truths. Good luck on your journey of exploration. Keep thinking, keep wondering, and keep challenging what seems obvious, because that's where the real discoveries begin. Thank you for your time and attention.